Move along. Move along. Quiet down. Watch your step. Who's this guy? Steven. Steven Seagal. Oh, him? Just another inmate. Keep it moving. The prison yard was buzzing. A group of burly inmates leaned against the walls, laughing and shouting, clearly marking their territory. Among them, a few young prisoners were already being intimidated, shoved, and mocked. The air smelled of sweat, iron, and tension. One thing was clear: these men ran this place. Or at least, they thought they did. Steven Seagal walked slowly, his posture calm, almost lazy. Hands tucked loosely at his sides, eyes scanning the yard with a quiet precision. To anyone watching, he seemed unremarkable, just another tall man moving through the chaos. But behind that placid exterior lay something lethal, a calm that masked deadly skill. "Hey, newbie," one of the bullies called out, a smirk plastered across his face. "Yeah, you. Come over here. We need to see what you're made of." Steven stopped, tilting his head slightly. He didn't speak. He didn't flinch. He didn't even raise an eyebrow. The inmates laughed, sensing fear, or at least expecting it. One of the bigger men, a hulking figure named Harris, stepped forward. "You think you can just walk around without respect?" he sneered. "We're going to teach you a lesson, nice and slow." He lunged at Steven, swinging a fist with all the confidence of someone who had never met resistance like this. Steven sidestepped smoothly, barely moving, his body flowing like water. Harris stumbled past him, off balance. A chuckle escaped Steven, low and almost inaudible. "What was that?" Harris roared, spinning around. "You mocking me?" Steven said nothing, just moved. In an instant, his hands were on Harris's shoulders, guiding the man's momentum. Harris crashed into the concrete wall behind him with a thud that silenced the yard. The other inmates froze, unsure if what they had just seen was a trick, a fluke, or something far more dangerous. "You okay?" Steven asked quietly, almost too calm, as if speaking to a child rather than a grown man twice his size. Harris groaned, trying to rise but finding himself pinned under the effortless weight of Steven's control. The yard was silent now. Every eye was on him. You can't do that," one of the bullies stammered. "He's just a guy? A regular inmate." "Not exactly," another muttered, backing away. Steven straightened. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't used force unnecessarily. And yet, the message was clear. He was not someone to be toyed with. Later, in the mess hall, the tension didn't ease. Harris and his crew whispered furiously among themselves, plotting revenge, eager to reclaim their dominance. They cornered Steven near the food line, shoving him into the wall with brute force. "Thought you could embarrass us in front of everyone." Harris spat. "You'll pay for that." Steven didn't respond. He inhaled slowly, his eyes narrowing, and then exploded with motion, fast, precise, and devastating. Every strike was calculated, every move a demonstration of absolute control. The first man went down with a quiet grunt. The second, trying to intervene, found himself gently yet firmly redirected into a table. The third barely had time to react before he stumbled back, clutching his ribs. The hall erupted into chaos. Screams, shouts, and clattering trays filled the air. Guards rushed in, but even they paused, stunned by the display. Steven's calm remained unshaken. He wasn't fighting to win. He was teaching a lesson. "Enough," he said, voice steady. End of it. The bullies lay sprawled on the floor, humiliated. They looked up at him not with anger, but fear. Fear mixed with respect. The lesson was learned without a word wasted. That night, Steven returned to his cell. Most prisoners were still whispering about him, sharing every detail, embellishing his movements, recounting how he had dismantled the strongest men in the yard with ease. He sat quietly, meditating in the dim light, preparing for whatever would come next. Word spread fast. By morning, every new inmate knew who Steven Seagal was. But while fear was one thing, envy and curiosity were another. A few tried to test him the next day, thinking perhaps they could succeed where others had failed. It didn't take long. Steven's reputation wasn't based on rumor. It was real, and it moved like a silent storm through the prison. A gang of 3 tried to corner him near the workshop, knives glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights. "Time to pay up for yesterday, old man." One of them sneered, circling him like predators. Stephen's eyes flickered, calm as ever. One fluid motion, and the knives were out of reach, his opponents flailing helplessly as he controlled their movements with precision. Not a single unnecessary strike, not a single drop of blood. Just control. Absolute dominance. "Don't make me repeat myself," he said quietly, guiding them toward the floor. They landed in a heap, groaning and defeated. From that day on, the dynamic shifted. Bullies no longer sought confrontation. Respect was earned, silently, without boasting. Stephen didn't need to threaten. His actions spoke volumes. The prisoners watched, some in awe, some in fear, all aware that crossing him was unthinkable. Even the guards noticed. They spoke in hushed tones, knowing the yard had changed. A prisoner who had once seemed ordinary had rewritten the rules of the game, not through words, but through sheer mastery of his craft. Weeks later, a particularly notorious gang, known for controlling the contraband trade, decided to test him. They cornered Stephen in the laundry room, bottles and metal pipes in hand. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. "You don't belong here," their leader said. "We run this place. Step aside or get hurt." Stephen tilted his head, eyes calm, voice steady. "I belong wherever I choose." What followed was swift, surgical, and silent. Movements so precise, so fluid, that the men barely understood what had happened until they were lying on the floor, defeated and ashamed. Not a scream, not a plea, just efficiency. By this point, Stephen had become a legend inside the walls. Stories spread of his skill, of his calm, of the way he could humiliate the strongest men with minimal effort. No one challenged him directly anymore. Instead, they watched, learned, and respected the silent force among them. One afternoon, the warden summoned him. "I've heard things," Warden Jacobs said, eyes wary. "About you in the yard." Stephen nodded slowly. "I keep the peace." "Peace," the warden scoffed. "You've humiliated half my top enforcers." "I correct imbalance," Stephen said evenly. "No more, no less." The warden sighed, realizing confrontation was pointless. Stephen Seagal wasn't just another inmate. He was a force, untouchable, calm, lethal, a man whose reputation alone kept the chaos at bay. Days turned into weeks. Stephen moved through the prison, always calm, always aware. Attempts to intimidate him ceased entirely. Even the guards adjusted their patrols, aware that any interaction required caution. Then came the final test, a coordinated attack by multiple gangs, aiming to reclaim their pride and territory. The silence in the cell block that night felt different. It wasn't the uneasy quiet that followed violence. It was order. An unnatural calm settled over the prison, as if the walls themselves had learned to breathe slower. Guards walked their rounds more cautiously now, not out of fear, but awareness. Something had shifted, and everyone knew it. Stephen sat on his bunk, eyes closed, breathing steady. He wasn't resting. He was listening. Footsteps, distant arguments, the clank of metal doors. Every sound told a story. The prison spoke to him, and he understood it. Across the block, Harris lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His body still ached, but the pain in his pride cut deeper. He had ruled through fear for years. Now, he couldn't even stand without remembering how easily Stephen had taken him apart. No rage burned in him anymore, only humiliation and fear. The next morning, the yard opened under a gray sky. Inmates poured out slowly, scanning their surroundings like prey. Conversations were muted. No laughter, no shouting. Stephen walked the perimeter alone, unbothered, his steps measured. A group of younger inmates watched him pass. One whispered, "That's him." Another replied, "Don't stare." Respect had replaced mockery. Distance replaced bravado. But not everyone was willing to accept the new balance. Deep within the prison, beyond the yard and the mess hall, a different kind of meeting was taking place. For men sat around a metal table in the maintenance wing, leaders from rival gangs who had never shared a room before. Tattoos, scars, and hard eyes told stories of violence. Their expressions now told something else. "This can't stand," one of them growled. One man doesn't change everything. He already has, another said quietly. And without weapons. That's exactly the problem, the first snapped. He makes us look weak. They decided then. Not a sloppy ambush. Not another humiliation. This would be final. Brutal. Overwhelming. Stephen sensed it before it happened. That afternoon, while returning from the workshop, the corridor lights flickered. The air shifted. His footsteps echoed too cleanly. He stopped. Then came the sound, doors slamming shut behind him. 6 men stepped out from the shadows. Bigger than the others. Smarter, too. No shouting. No insults. Just intent. Nothing personal, one said. Just business. Stephen exhaled slowly. The first man rushed him with a blade. Stephen moved inside the attack, redirecting the arm, twisting the wrist. Bone cracked. The blade hit the floor. The second man swung a pipe. Stephen dropped low, sweeping the legs, sending him crashing. The third grabbed him from behind. A subtle shift of weight. A shoulder lock. The man screamed before hitting the ground. The corridor exploded into motion. Stephen didn't strike with anger. He didn't rush. Every movement was economical, controlled. A push became a fall. A grip became surrender. One by one, the attackers collapsed, broken not by force, but by precision. The last man hesitated. You should walk away, Stephen said. The man did. By the time guards arrived, they found Stephen standing alone, hands relaxed at his sides, surrounded by groaning bodies. No resistance. No explanation. That night, the warden reviewed the footage in silence. Rewound it. Watched again. No excessive force, he muttered. Not even close. The decision was made quietly. Stephen was moved, not to isolation, but to a different block, one known for its worst offenders. A place where violence had never been controlled. The transfer was meant to test him. It backfired. Within days, fights stopped. Gangs dissolved. Disputes were settled without blood. Stephen didn't intervene often, but when he did, it was absolute. No arguments. No revenge. Men twice his size avoided his gaze. Those who watched closely began to change, not out of fear, but understanding. Control was power. Discipline was dominance. One evening, a guard approached his cell. Why don't you take advantage of it? The guard asked quietly. You could run this place. Stephen shook his head. That's not why I'm here. For what, then? Stephen looked through the bars, eyes calm. To remind people who they are when fear isn't leading them. The guard had no reply. Weeks passed. Rumors spread beyond the prison walls. Stories exaggerated. Legends formed. A man who broke violence without becoming it. A presence that ended chaos by existing within it. Then, without warning, the day came. Pack your things, a guard said. You're being released. Stephen stood, calm as always. As he walked through the gates, inmates watched in silence. No cheers. No words. Just respect. Some nodded. Others lowered their eyes. Outside, the air felt different. Lighter. Stephen paused, looking back once at the walls that had tried, and failed, to define him. Inside, the prison remained changed. Bullies humbled. Order restored. A reminder etched into concrete and memory. They never knew who he truly was when he arrived. They never forgot who he was when he left. The gates closed behind him with a heavy metallic echo, but Stephen didn't flinch. He stood there for a moment, letting the sound fade, letting the weight of the place fall away. The prison had tried to break him, test him, consume him. Instead, it had been forced to adapt to him. A black sedan waited beyond the fence. Stephen approached calmly. The driver stepped out, tall, clean-cut, eyes sharp. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. You caused quite a ripple in there, the man said. Stephen opened the door himself. They caused it long before I arrived. The car pulled away from the prison, the walls shrinking in the rearview mirror. Silence filled the vehicle, not awkward, not tense, just understood. You humiliated men who built their lives on fear, the driver finally said. That kind of thing doesn't disappear. Stephen looked out the window. Fear only lasts when it's fed. The city unfolded ahead of them. Concrete. Steel. Crowds moving fast, unaware of how close chaos always lived beneath the surface. Inside the prison, the aftershocks were still spreading. Harris sat at a table in the mess hall, untouched tray in front of him. For the first time in years, no one avoided him out of fear. They avoided him because he no longer mattered. Power had shifted, not to another bully, not to another gang, but to something quieter. Order. A younger inmate took the seat across from him. No challenge. No disrespect. Things are different now, the kid said. Harris nodded slowly. Yeah. Think he'll come back? Harris shook his head. Doesn't need to. The realization hit him harder than any blow Stephen had delivered. The prison no longer needed an enforcer. It had learned restraint. Days passed. The warden filed reports that raised more questions than answers. Violence dropped. Complaints disappeared. The system didn't know how to categorize what had happened. They couldn't measure discipline. They couldn't log humiliation. Outside, Stephen resumed a quiet life. No interviews. No statements. No acknowledgement of what he had done. To the world, he was invisible again. But to those who knew, those who had seen, it was different. Stories traveled. From inmate to inmate. From guard to guard. Whispered accounts of a man who never raised his voice, never lost control, never needed permission. A man who dismantled bullies by exposing what they really were. Weak. Late one evening, Stephen stood alone in a small training room. Mats on the floor. Dim lighting. No audience. He moved slowly, deliberately, practicing forms that flowed like water. Every motion carried purpose, balance, intent, control. Somewhere, far away, inside concrete walls, men remembered the feeling of helplessness, not from being beaten, but from being understood. And they never wanted to feel it again. Stephen finished his movements and stood still, breathing evenly. The world would keep producing bullies. Places like that prison would keep existing. But now, somewhere deep in the system, a quiet truth had been planted. Power doesn't come from intimidation. It comes from mastery. And mastery doesn't announce itself. It waits. Months passed, but the prison never returned to what it once was. New inmates arrived with the same instincts, testing boundaries, measuring weakness, but they were quickly corrected. Not by fists, by silence, by older inmates who had learned the hard way that chaos had consequences. Don't, they would say. That path's closed. No one needed to explain why. The yard remained tense, but controlled. Guards noticed fewer fights, fewer injuries. Paperwork became lighter. Whispers replaced threats. The system adapted, even if it didn't understand how. And yet, not everyone had let go. Outside those walls, some men carried humiliation like a disease. The kind that doesn't fade, it festers. Harris was one of them. Released early on good behavior, he walked free with a body healed but a spirit fractured. The world felt smaller now, louder, less forgiving. Everywhere he went, he felt watched, measured, insignificant. He knew exactly why. One man, Harris, tried to forget. He failed. One night, sitting alone in a dim bar, he heard a name spoken casually at a nearby table. Not loud, not dramatic, just a passing comment. Stephen. His grip tightened around the glass. The next weeks were spent asking questions. Quiet ones. Careful ones. Harris didn't want revenge, not exactly. He wanted understanding. Closure. Something to explain why his strength had meant nothing. The trail led him to a modest building on the edge of town. No signs. No crowds. Just silence. Inside, the room was empty except for mats and soft lighting. Stephen stood at the far end, eyes calm, as if he had expected him. Harris froze. I just wanted to talk, Harris said, voice rough. Stephen nodded. Then talk. Harris struggled for words. You broke me in there. And you didn't even look angry. Stephen stepped closer, not threatening, not defensive. Because it wasn't about you. Then what was it about? Harris snapped. Stephen met his gaze. Control. You never had it. Fear did. Silence filled the room. Harris exhaled shakily. The anger he'd carried for months drained out, replaced by something heavier. Regret. I don't know how to live without it, he admitted. Stephen gestured to the mat. Then learn. Harris hesitated, then stepped forward. The training wasn't violent. No strikes. No humiliation. Just movement. Balance. Discipline. For the first time in his life, Harris felt power without dominance. Outside, the world kept spinning. New conflicts, new bullies, new prisons. But somewhere, quietly, the cycle had been interrupted. Not ended. Interrupted. Stephen continued teaching. Not publicly, not loudly, only to those who sought control rather than power. And the legend remained exactly where it belonged. Not in headlines, not in stories shouted for attention, but in the minds of those who understood what they had witnessed. A prison had tried to break a man. Instead, it had been forced to change. Years later, the prison was barely recognizable. New paint covered old scars. Surveillance had improved. Training programs replaced punishment cycles. Violence still existed, but it no longer ruled. The place had learned something it never intended to learn. Fear was inefficient. Some guards who had been there during Stephen's time still worked the corridors. They never spoke his name out loud, but they remembered. Whenever a situation escalated, someone would inevitably say, "Handle it before it gets like that." Everyone knew what that meant. Stephen never returned. He didn't need to. Harris trained quietly for months. The arrogance that once defined him faded, replaced by patience and discipline. He never became dangerous again, but he became stable, whole. When he finally walked away, he bowed without being told. Stephen accepted it without comment. Time passed. Stephen aged, but his movements never lost clarity. His life stayed simple. No spotlight, no declarations, just balance. Occasionally, someone new would walk through the door, broken, angry, searching. Stephen treated them all the same. Calm, honest, unyielding. "You don't need to win," he would say. "You need to control." Far away, another prison opened. Another system failed. Another group of men tried to rule through intimidation. The world repeated itself. But now and then, somewhere in that cycle, someone remembered. Someone chose restraint. Someone stepped back instead of striking. And that was enough. Stephen stood alone one evening, finishing his practice as the light faded. He paused, breathing steady, grounded. No audience. No recognition. Just mastery. The story didn't end with applause. It ended with silence. And silence held.